Rome, the eternal city. Imagine her in her glory, bathed in the glow of 1,000 torches, her streets alive with the pulse of the empire that seemed destined to rule forever. There she was, majestic, untouchable, her legions stretching across continents, her people thriving from the bounty of lands near and far. Picture the buzz of her marketplaces, the laughter echoing through marble halls, the gods smiling down from their temples. But as history often whispers, even the mightiest can be brought low by forces unseen. Today, I want to take you back to the 3rd century AD, when the Roman Empire, at the height of its grandeur, faced an enemy that would strike at her very heart, an enemy that neither sword nor shield could hold at bay. This was an adversary as old as humanity itself, yet more ruthless and unforgiving than any foe Rome had ever known. The Plague of Cyprian. They called it Cyprian after a bishop, Cyprian of Carthage, who watched as the world he knew dissolved around him, and who in his writings left us the only surviving record of its horrors. His words, full of anguish and helplessness, paint a haunting image of a disease that struck so swiftly, so completely, that it seemed as if death itself had taken up residence in Rome. The plague began quietly, slipping in unnoticed. Perhaps it came from Alexandria, or maybe even further away, across the sands of Egypt, brought by a single traveler or a single rat, carrying within it a deadly contagion. In the beginning, it was just a faint murmur, a strange fever, a distant sickness affecting only the poorest, those whose lives were already shadowed by hardship. But then, oh, how it spread. Within days, that distant murmur became a deafening roar. The streets of Rome filled with the sick, their bodies feverish, their skin blistered and broken by red sores. Entire families were ravaged, entire neighborhoods fell silent, and the once bustling forums and markets became ghostly, haunted places. No one knew where it had come from, nor did they know how to stop it. Fear took hold, and let me tell you, there is nothing as dangerous, as insidious, as the kind of fear that spreads in the dark. People whispered that the gods had turned their backs. They lit torches and made offerings, pleading for mercy, begging for protection. But the disease paid no heed to their pleas, no heed to wealth or status. From the poorest farmer to the wealthiest patrician, from the soldier in his barracks to the noble in his villas, all were equally vulnerable, and when it touched them, it did so without mercy. You must imagine it. The heat of a relentless fever, the skin erupting in angry sores, a racking, tearing pain that made every breath a battle. And once it struck, it moved fast, like wildfire, leaving only emptiness in its wake. Friends, neighbors, even family members were forced to turn away from their loved ones in their last moments. There were too many dead, too many dying, and too few left to bury them. The Roman legions, Rome's pride, her invincible guardians, were not spared. One by one soldiers fell to the disease, and as they weakened, so did the empire's borders. Enemies who had once feared the might of Rome watched with keen eyes as her forces dwindled, and they began to advance, sensing opportunity. Tribes that had been kept at bay for generations now pressed forward, no longer afraid, no longer outnumbered. They sensed weakness, and they were right. But it wasn't only on the battlefield that Rome suffered, no. The empire began to crumble from within as well. With so many dead, the economy faltered. Crops withered in the fields, left untended, while trade dwindled to a shadow of what it had been. Towns, once vibrant with the hum of commerce, became places of silence and sorrow. Coins lost their value. Merchants closed their stalls, and those who survived found themselves facing a world far harsher and far darker than the one they had known. And in this darkness, in this silence, something else began to shift. The temples of the old gods grew quiet, the altars barren, the sacrifices left untouched. For many, the gods of Rome no longer seemed to listen, no longer seemed to care. And so, in their despair, people began to look elsewhere, to a new faith, one that promised salvation beyond the suffering of this world. Christianity, once a fledgling sect, hidden in the shadows, began to rise. Imagine it. Families gathered in secret, whispering prayers not to Jupiter or Mars, but to a different god. A god who, they believed, had known suffering as they had. It was in the face of this unseen terror, this plague that ravaged their lives, that Christianity took root in Rome's heart. And as the empire struggled to hold itself together, the new faith spread, filling the cracks left by the old ways. Cyprian wrote that it felt as if a darkness had descended, a darkness that would never fully lift, and perhaps in a way, he was right, because the Rome that emerged from this plague, it was a different Rome, a Rome weakened, a Rome vulnerable, a Rome forever changed by an invisible enemy that left its mark not just on bodies, but on the very soul of the empire. And yet history forgot. This plague which killed hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, or this plague that shifted the very course of an empire, was lost to the sands of time, hidden in the shadows of more visible events, more famous names. But make no mistake, for those who lived through it, it was a horror unlike any other. But the tragedy of Rome was far from over. The Cyprian Plague left in its wake more than empty streets, abandoned farms, and grieving families. It left a wound so deep that it would shape the destiny of the empire and forever alter the course of history. So as the years passed, the empire struggled to regain its footing. What had once been unshakable, the legions, the economy, the faith of the people and their leaders, was now fragile, like a statue weathered by centuries of storms. The plague didn't just take lives, it took away confidence, the sense of security, the belief that Rome was invincible. And so as waves of sickness ebbed and flowed, the very heart of the empire grew weaker, pulsing slower with each passing year. The soldiers, who had once stood so proudly, clad in gleaming armor, now moved more like shadows. The fields, once bursting with grain to feed the empire's vast population, lay barren. There were no longer enough hands to till the earth or reap the harvest. And what crops remained were often left to rot, their bounty untouched, a silent testament to the absence of those who once tended them. Trade, that lifeblood of the Roman economy, dwindled. Markets that once overflowed with exotic goods from far-off lands now stood empty. Silk and spices, gold and gemstones, these treasures, so prized, became rarities. Ships once laden with precious cargo were abandoned at port, their sails flapping uselessly in the wind, their captains gone, their crews lost to the plague. As resources thinned, so too did the empire's ability to hold its borders. The legions, once so vast they seemed unbreakable, were stretched to their limits. And Rome's enemies, long held at bay, saw their chance. Tribes from the north, the Goths, the Vandals, began to press against Rome's weakened frontiers. They saw in Rome not the mighty colossus it once had been, but a wounded beast struggling to hold itself together. They saw vulnerability, and they seized it. And while Rome's borders crumbled, so too did her spirit. The gods who had once commanded such loyalty, whose temples had once been filled with the scents of incense and offerings, seemed distant. It was as if they had turned their backs, leaving Rome to face this nightmare alone. But in this darkness, in this void left by the old gods, a new light emerged. Christianity, once persecuted, once forced to worship in secret, began to rise. This new faith, offering hope in a life beyond, a promise of salvation after the suffering, spoke to the people in ways that the ancient gods could not. And as more and more Romans turned to Christianity, the very soul of the empire began to change. The temples of Jupiter, of Mars, of Venus fell silent, their marble columns standing cold and empty, while new gatherings, new voices echoed the words of a different God, one who preached love, forgiveness, hope in the face of despair. Consider how she changed in those years. The plague had torn open her heart, and into that wound poured a new faith, new beliefs, new ideas. And with them came a transformation that would forever alter not only Rome, but the course of the entire Western world. The Cyprian Plague, long forgotten, left scars that stretched far beyond its time, scars that would never fully heal. And though history remembers emperors and battles, conquests and victories, the story of Rome's fall is incomplete without this silent killer, this invisible force that weakened her from within. And so as we look back at this forgotten tragedy, this plague that swept through Rome and left her a shadow of her former self, we must ask, what other stories, what other echoes from the past have been left behind, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be told? For here on Echoes of the Past, we bring these forgotten tales back to life, shedding light on the shadows of history so that we might better understand the world we live in today. Because in these stories, in these ancient whispers, lies the truth of who we are. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Rome's darkest hour. If you've been moved, if you've learned something new, don't forget to subscribe and join us.